Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here. Thank you hugely for making time for this. We have a great set of speakers and authors of the report who will be presenting the work that we've been doing, and a great set of panelists to discuss it. We started doing this work when Somalia was in the midst of a devastating drought and facing a severe threat of famine. And getting attention on responding to Somalia crisis was hard because everyone was preoccupied with Ukraine. And we're presenting this report as Somalia is in the grip of devastating floods, and it's hard to get attention to Somalia because everyone's focused on Gaza. And so it's a sign of both the sort of the range and breadth of crisis that Somalia faces, and I guess a reinforcement of one of the messages of the report, that's important to focus on Somali capacities to respond to crises in their own country and how international actors can best support that. And I'll hand over to the authors to hear more about that in a minute. As I've said, it'd be great if you can introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm meant to be writing brief technical instructions. So yes, do ask questions or put comments in the chat. Do mute yourselves when you're not speaking. Please note the event's been recorded and will be shared with you and posted on the Humanitarian Outcomes and UKHH's website. And as I've just said, the event will first look briefly at the report's findings, and then we'll have a discussion with the discussants, and then open it up for Q&A. Very happy to introduce the speakers and the authors of the report. Peter Haley, the Director of the Centre for Humanitarian Change. Nisar, as an independent researcher and consultant, as is Irina Mosel and Guhad Arden. And I'm realizing that I don't have your bios in front of me, so I'm going to leave you to introduce yourselves more fully as you start to introduce the report. And on that note, I think I'll hand over to Peter, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you about the findings of the work you've been doing between, I'm trying to remember when we got started. Most of the research was done between sort of April and August of this year.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Peter Haley, and I was working with a group of researchers and consultants who, all of us together, have had many years of experience of working in for Somalia and with Somalis, particularly related to the last three major crises, but a lot of work in between. So what we tried to do was take a look at the crisis from the point of view of what has been changing. How has it changed since 2011? And the reason that we did that was that in the time when we were doing the planning for this review, we had the same sorts of drivers of the crisis. We had the drought, in this case, an unprecedented series of failed rain seasons. We had the continued conflict with the increased attention to liberating areas from al-Shabaab control. And we had the same kind of warning messages and messages of urgency to prevent famine and prevent widespread suffering and excess mortality. What we found, and the changes that we were particularly focusing on, were about what had changed in Somali society and Somali systems. And when we say systems, we mean things like the government, the way that the social networks work in Somalia, the public and the private sector, diaspora, and those types of things. What had changed since 2011? And we felt with all of our research and our research experience and connections with Somalia that things had changed. What we found was that by the time we were wrapping up our research, that the crisis was less devastating than was originally feared when we were sending out quite urgent messages in late 2021. Why? We tried to understand why, and we were understanding that there was quite a few other evaluations going on, which were looking directly at the humanitarian response. Our perspective was the response was slow to start, but reached $2.2 billion in the end, and definitely contributed to this less devastating crisis than we feared. And what we wanted to bring out was to what extent the Somali response was also a part of the reason that we didn't end up in such a bad situation as we thought. And we found that that it was significant, but that it was not well understood. Next, please. We tried to make the report and this presentation forward-looking. As I said, most of us, almost all of us, were long-term researchers, particularly on these upstages in crisis. And whenever a new crisis comes along, we have to kind of repress that feeling of, oh no, not again. And are we just redoing what we've always been doing? And how have we improved between the crises and during the crisis? So we try to make the report as forward-looking as possible to try and look at what could be done into the next crisis, not knowing that the next crisis was just 1 or 2 months after we published the report. But the intention is of this presentation and the report to look forward into how we can make recommendations that can be used in future crisis. Next, please. So what we found from the humanitarian response side was that there were some successful adaptations. To name a few, the attention to marginalisation, exclusion, and testing out different ways to address marginalisation and exclusion was one of the successful adaptations. And also re-establishing access to hard-to-reach populations. In the report, there's more nuanced discussions on those and other things. Development was much more engaged in 2022 in the response. For example, the significant work of World Bank in responding to the humanitarian crisis. And overall, there is noticeable progress, significant progress in adapting the response from the one that we did in 2011 and into 2012. But too often we found that the response seemed to be designed as if parts of the response seemed to be designed as if Somalia was the same as it was in 2011. For example, a perspective of the capacities of the IDPs seemed to be very, very similar to the perspective that we had in the middle of 2011 as people were trekking out into Kenya and Ethiopia and into the periphery on borderline IDP, on the border IDP sites. Another example was that, for example, in the hard-to-reach areas, there was a period between 2011 and 2022 where there was a lot more focus and a lot more efforts to work in hard-to-reach areas, and this seemed to have dropped off. And we got back into this cyclical process of restarting programs in 2022 and 23 in hard-to-reach areas. The adaptations and the successes that were made in 2022 as the response scaled up were made while the response was scaling up and not before. And this created quite a number of delays, hurried application or action on these adaptations, and some inappropriate adaptations. Next, please. So one of our main kind of perspectives or conclusions was that despite the progress in humanitarian response in those successful adaptations, we're questioning whether, with that very short period between the kind of moment to reflect on what we did well and what we didn't do well in the drought response, and then the very quick uptake of the El Nino response in Somalia. Are we still applying those, or are we falling back on what the kind of refrain that yeah, we would like to do all of these successful adaptations, but we will have to wait until after the response to start applying them. And it's very clear that with the way that the humanitarian response happens in Somalia, with very quick rotations, with a lot of international staff rotating in and out, and not constantly in Somalia, that institutional memory is a significant problem. And our question is, into the El Nino and then afterwards into the next crisis, how can we establish more of a sustainable shift in approach, and how can we maintain that institutional memory instead of relying on one or two or three types of people like us, the authors, to keep bringing back this institutional memory. Next, please. Over to you, Guhat.
Thank you very much. My name is Guhat Adan, and I'm an independent research and consulting guy, and working with Peter, Nisar, and most of the guys that we are working together here. And to look at mobility, and mobility in Somalia is not a new thing. And it is an important resilience strategy in Somalia. And if you look at the history of Somalia, mobility has been one of the main things in terms of resilience and resilience building and access to assistance. There have been agricultural mobility, especially when agricultural people are moving from one place to another in search of agricultural labor, on farm labor that is. Pastoralist and mobility, which is in search of water and pasture from one region to another. The other aspect of mobility has been the regional mobility, and you see from one region to another. Within the region, for example, you see Somalis in different countries. A good example, my friend, my brother, Idrus, who was born in Ethiopia, lived in Kenya and Somalia, working in Kenya and Somalia. That is the nature of Somalis. And however, the other new phenomena in the past decades was the international migration and diaspora. And the beautiful part of that one was that the Somali diaspora played an important role in terms of supporting during crisis and resilience building. And of course, that is the function of mobility, and as well, the function of development of social capital within the Somali society. And the social network, for example, essential for resilience and mobility decision-making, such as family division, people dividing themselves, some remaining in the villages or in the district, others moving to other places in search of opportunities, and around security and livelihood and the like, running away from security issues or in search of livelihood, as we said in the olden days. But the difference is not the difference of the olden mobility and the current mobility of the IDPs, for example. Those who are moving out or in the IDP movement now, these are people who have been pressurized to leave their place because of circumstance, either livelihood circumstances, security, and in search of better life in terms of access to humanitarian assistance, which because of security, accessing where they are became an issue. Next slide, please. And having said that, I think one important thing is that the level of mobility between the different Somali clans has also been different. And the pastoral communities were more ahead, a lot of mobilities and a lot of movement from region to another, and modernized that kind of nomadic mobility when they came, or Somali became government, since Somali became government, and the nature of mobility was brought again into the urban system, and that mobility assisted the dominant clans to be more mobile in the region, within the region, I mean, or in the going to getting access to international mobility. And as such, then that capacity of movement, that capacity of having diaspora outside is not equally distributed within the clans in Somalia. You'll see some clans having more diaspora, more mobility, as such then social capital to lean on during crisis, while some, because of the nature of their mobility being local and based on more of the agricultural one, then it becomes, they are likely to have lesser diaspora and lesser social capital. And on that note again, not every clan or not every clan or every region have the same mobility and the same benefit from that one. In that case, then we try to focus more on some clans that we had chance to look at them during our previous studies, and we wanted to understand their particular problems and how they are affected by how they are affected by the crisis and how they try to adapt with the crisis through their mobility system. Interestingly, for some clans, the problems or the crisis have been an opportunity. It's like by responding or adapting the crisis, they try to develop their the social capital and access to resources from within. But unfortunately, some of the clans are not have not developed that. So there is that imbalance between the clans, and that is a big there's a big gap there. Having said that, the aid system have not really understood very well that kind of aid, how the mobility of the different clans, how the displacement is happening, and it's more of trying, the aid system is trying to generalize it without looking particularly the particular difference within the regions and or even the clans. In that sense, again, you also see within the aid system the displacement being commercialized to some extent and becoming business and exploited. And to overcome the outcome of this kind of exploitation and commercializing aid is not, or commercializing displacement is not well understood by the aid actors also. So in that sense, some of the things that we are talking about here in terms of looking forward is more of transforming the IDP response to support Somali resilience capacity and mitigate significant harms of responses. That is addressing the underlying issues within the displacement system, underlying issues in terms of within the efforts of resilience building. How can that humanitarian respond? How can humanitarian respond to that? Then is probably a well-designed durable solution, and vice versa. Over.
Thank you. Next, please. So one of the particular issues that we looked at is how marginalization and exclusion was dealt with during the response, but also how the response was driving more marginalization and exclusion. So there was a lot of progress made in including marginalization in program design and planning and how to reduce the drivers. Examples are adaptations to information tools, inclusion of minorities and minority groups in various decision-making and planning and discussion groups, inclusion efforts, a lot of efforts to include make sure that marginalized peoples are included in the targeting criteria, and a lot of discussions and work on making sure that we take into account minority languages. But the aid system still seems to be unwilling to reckon with its own role of driving marginalization. So we still struggle to understand how, for instance, corruption and diversion is in itself, in the way that we drive corruption and diversion in our design of our programs, how that has negative impacts on the marginalization. And we found that especially in the IDP response. And it tends to be the marginalization, exclusion, kind of the people who have less power. When we start to get into those discussions, at times it seems like it's relegated to the protection cluster or seen as a development issue because it's a structural power issue and political issue and social economy issue. Although there was progress made, there still seems to be a tendency to think of this issue in that sense. So when we look now at what's happening and the massive response and struggle to deal with the El Nino floods, our question is really, what are we doing and what can we do to make sure that we maintain our successes on marginalization? How can we, in the next 2 or 3 years, how can we make sure that it's embedded enough in the aid structure and the processes so that we're not rushing the next time there's a massive crisis and making the mistakes that were some of the mistakes that were made, or remaking the mistakes that were made in 2022 and 23? And how can we learn? Is there a learning process to learn what more in detail, what was good, what was bad, what we shouldn't do next time during 2022 to 23? Or is all of that being pushed or washed away by the El Nino response? Next, please. Corruption and diversion. It's very clear that the corruption and diversion is systemic and widespread. I use the word systemic very carefully to describe what has happened in Somalia. And the aid system is struggling to accept its role in driving corruption and diversion. So the aid system certainly understands that corruption and diversion is happening within its programs, but it's not so accepting or taking responsibility for the way that our programs are designed that drive corruption and diversion. So we do a lot of things to try and stop it. For instance, biometric targeting, biometric work, but we don't really look at how the IDP's response, for instance, is organized so that we end up with a lot of corruption and diversion, for instance, focused on the gatekeepers, or even in the way that contracts are drawn up with the organizations who are responding at the field level within those IDP sites. The design of the IDP response is again and again seen as one of the most significant drivers of corruption and diversion. And corruption and diversion is very, very closely linked to the process of marginalization and driving more and more marginalization. Looking forward again, we need to continue to have discussions which are ongoing, but continue to have those discussions about aid accountability for contributing to corruption and diversion. In Somalia, many Somalis feel that corruption and diversion is as a result of the way that we implement our humanitarian development and security responses, and that it's not and it's something that we have brought to Somalia, and we need to take accountability on that. And the only way that we can do that is to treat it as a systemic problem and use systemic action rather than more short-term and risk mitigation actions. So a long-term sustained and collective action is required across the whole of humanitarian development and government and international and national parts of the system. Next, please. Hard to reach populations, the word's accepted. We pushed, the humanitarian response pushed to reach out to concentrations, the most vulnerable and at risk, and the source of the most IDPs in the urban centres. And progress was made, and but we still have many lessons learned. And looking forward, how can we maintain the presence and innovation that went into reaching out further into those hard-to-reach areas, and are those lessons being synthesized and learned more detailed than just in reports like ours? And how are we using those lessons learned in the El Nino response? Next, please. So we looked at information systems. Many IDPs do not return, and instead they'll stay in urban precarity and part of the larger urbanization trend. And many, as we're pointing out elsewhere, the Somali capacities have significantly contributed to the prevention of famine. Yet, when we look at the information tools that we're using at the moment, we don't really have that much of a good focus on urban livelihoods. We're still particularly focused on pastoral, agro-pastoral, and riverine livelihoods, particularly missing a lot more information that would be possible from the urban poor. And we need to improve our measurement of Somali capacities and their contribution to mitigating the shock. Next, please. Over to you, Irina. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Irina Moselle. I'm also an independent consultant and researcher who worked with Peter and the team on this report. Looking at violence and conflict, there have been new patterns of conflict, especially a marked escalation of conflict between the government and Al-Shabaab in 22-23. There was also some recovery of territory by the government that could allow for greater access for aid, but this is not necessarily permanent, as tasks still change hands quite frequently. But even if the areas of conflict were not necessarily the same as the epicenter where the drought was, there's still a number of things that humanitarians need to take into account. One is the resurgence, the potential resurgence we've seen in clan and resource-based conflict in some areas, particularly because of the government mobilization of clan militia. And also the volatility that results from increased conflict that may result in reduced aid and trade access, increased displacement, and also civilian casualties. Looking forward, it will be important to learn from previous experiences of political instrumentalization of aid. For example, in areas with changing power dynamics, where Al-Shabaab, for example, has retreated, to be aware of the risks that one group may use resources for territorial expansion over another. Next, please. In terms of Somali systems and crisis response, there's also been a change of capacity at different levels. We've seen a greater role of government at all levels, both in terms of institutional and constitutional structures, but also more presence at state levels, district levels. We've seen a more significant role of Somali NGOs and civil society at all levels, in particular with regards to how to reach areas. And we've also seen, as in previous crises, private sector and diaspora playing a significant part of the response, often being the first and the fastest to respond. Next, please. At the same time, the government has also been fragmented with many political rivalries and different, often unclear functions between different ministries. And also a fierce debate around the priorities around security, and particularly the ongoing offensive, development, or humanitarian aid. The government also still feels marginalized from taking a leading role in all parts of the response, often just feeling that they are being consulted only in the implementation phase, but not being part of the conceptualization, planning, and strategy ahead. There are also still substantial issues with regards to partnerships and trust in civil society. In particular, the lack of real partnerships with Somali NGOs, where often still limited funds go directly to Somali NGOs. The relationship is still very transactional, no real risk sharing, but also a lack of trust in terms of a perception of corruption, despite significant efforts by Somali NGOs and other groups to address this, and also a lack of trust in the government and its integrity. In terms of aid and private sector, they still struggle often to find a common ground during the response, and there might be more scope for strategic partnerships, but often private sector is still seen as service providers, and so there hasn't been necessarily a common ground that was found. And similarly with the diaspora, there's also been a lack of trust, and also diaspora actors might see humanitarian actors as slow, bureaucratic, and might not necessarily want to be associated with the humanitarian. Next, please. looking forward, it'll be important to, again, learn some of the lessons around Somali systems and their capacity for crisis response, in particular around government leadership. Will we see an increased leadership and increased coordination with the government in El Niño and other responses going forward? Secondly, also thinking and looking around what does it take to really move partnerships with civil society and Somali NGOs from subcontracting to real partnerships, and the investments that that takes. And lastly, the similarly continued support to both the government and Somali civil society to continue the progress on accountability and integrity, which will require a more system-wide effort to support risk management procedures and institutions. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Peter for a conclusion.
So our areas for action, there's many more, of course, in the report. Very quickly, we feel that there's a need to be a radical rethink or a transformation of the IDP response system in Somalia. We feel that there's needs to be a longer term and a sustained systemic approach to dealing with corruption and diversion. Leave No One Behind has got off to a good start in 2022 and 23. Now, how can we embed that more fully and use it in system-wide approaches to addressing marginalisation and exclusion, and adapt the response to engage with changes in Somali resilience and Somali systems. Next, please. So it's a pivotal moment right now and an opportunity for international aid in Somalia. We have the successes of 2022 in preventing the famine, and we are aware that Somalia is changing, and in many ways, the way it's changing is creating a greater resilience capacity among Somalis, but also with Somali systems. That's not to say that there's not that's complete or that's always in the right direction, but there are significant opportunities. But we have this problem of a cycle of learning and forgetting. Every time that there's a space to breathe between the crises, we seem to not spend enough time in consolidating what we've learned from the previous crisis, and then going into the new crisis, we either very quickly implement things where we make mistakes and we don't do as well as we could, or we put it off until after the crisis because we don't have time right now because we should be concentrating on preventing famine, for example. One of the problems is going to be that some of the main successes in 2022 are not about what we're doing. So in 2011, what we learned was that we need to do much more cash programming. What we've learned in 2022 is that we need to do a lot more of these more soft things and addressing marginalisation and exclusion, or looking at corruption and diversion as a systemic issue, or changing the way that we interact with IDPs and people who are displaced. And that's more difficult to do for the humanitarian system. Looking forward, we keep mentioning the El Niño response mostly because it's a perfect example of this situation of saying, yeah, you're right, we really need to do this, but right now we've got to stop these people from dying and being badly affected by the floods, and we'll deal with that sometime in March or April next year, by which time many people who have left will be into the next crisis, and many of the lessons will have been lost, and the only good thing coming out of that is all of us as consultants, we will get more pay next time to write the same report. And how to take a longer view of the humanitarian aid and how it operates in Somalia. We need to challenge the fact that we've been there as humanitarians for at least 30 or 40 years, and we continue to argue that longer-term view is not our job. It seems that we could do a much better job in the short term if we did have that longer-term view. That's over from me, and back to you, Paul.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter, and thank you the other authors you had, and Sarah Narina and the whole team that worked on it. We're going to hear now from discussants. We're going to hear from Freddie Carver first, then from Adris Dar, and then from Javier. So Freddie, great if you can sort of get yourself up on screen. Freddie is the head of the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat that works on behalf of a coalition of 14 NGOs to promote solutions for displacement-affected communities in the Horn of Africa. And he's been involved with aid policy and programming in the region for a long time. I'm going to hand over to you, Freddie, in the hope that you're about to appear on the screen. I can't actually see you. But
thanks. I have turned my video on. Can you hear me?
I now can hear you and see you. Far away.
Okay, perfect. I can't see myself, which is always a bit dangerous. But thank you very much, and thank you so much for the opportunity today on what I think is really, and I want to start by just congratulating Peter and the team, because I think this is such a good and important report at an important moment, and I think it's a complicated set of messages, but it's also, I think, very clear in its kind of in the strength of its message. And I think one of the interesting things about it is that in some ways this is a kind of a positive moment, in that things weren't as bad as they might have been, but rather than kind of pat ourselves on the back, which is sometimes what we do, actually they're asking some really kind of deep and fundamental questions, which I think we all know we need to keep asking. But what I think is really fantastic is the different elements that you've managed to bring together into the paper, and for me they all connect, and I kind of want to start my comments really where you ended, Peter, which is this question around the kind of the sort of macro picture. And I think for me the most important word that kept cropping up in the report, and you raised it in your presentation, is the one systemic or system-wide. And I think this is something we really need to reflect upon quite deeply, because it has a number of implications. And I think the kind of the starting point for me is that fundamentally in a context like Somalia, when humanitarian operations and activity has been implemented with differences but continuously for 30, 40 years, and I draw a lot of there are a lot of differences between Somalia and South Sudan, a place I know better myself. But I do draw comparisons here, and I think certainly in this region that there are a number of comparisons around this area. But when we are present, when the humanitarian system is present like this on an ongoing basis for decades, we become part of the political economy system of the country. And I think we don't reflect enough on what that really means. And I think one of the implications of it is that it becomes very hard to unpick cause and effect. And I think this is some of the complexity that you start to bring out when we think about our kind of mental models for displacement, and how people are kind of forced to move from place X to place Y, and we talk about pull and push factors. And I think you kind of rightly raise some of the kind of overly simplistic narratives that there are around the kind of that there tend to be around the fact that we think that where aid goes, it tends to attract people, and that's why they go there, and so on. I think you unpack that really well. But I think the kind of fundamental point is it's a cycle. We're all kind of, from Somali populations to Somali authorities, to NGOs, to UN agencies, to donors, we're all conditioned to work in a certain way. And we all sort of know also, we have expectations about what other parts of the system will do. And so this system has built up over a long time, and while it changes and adapts, and I think it's much more flexible in its adaptation from the kind of ground level side and from the Somali population side, which you bring out in the report, I think as a kind of international community, we're much slower to flex and change. Really, we use different words, but I think fundamentally we often end up doing very similar things to the things we were doing decades ago. But these things become very hard to unpick. So the conclusion of that for me is really deep about how we kind of change and how we go forwards. And I think, and I see one of the issues that kind of keeps coming up, I think, across the region at the moment, is the impact of aid cuts and the impact of aid suspensions as well. We've seen a couple of quite large suspensions this year. And we all know that the humanitarian kind of funding is under kind of real strain across the region, even while needs continue to rise and crises continue to kind of happen. And I think we need to ask ourselves some really serious questions around what are the implications of that, not just in terms of the programs that we run or the kind of humanitarian inputs that we're seeking to support populations with, but fundamentally our presence in these countries. And I think I've become fairly convinced over the years that actually the kind of largest part of the impact of the humanitarian system over time in countries like this is at least as much, if not more, in the salaries that we pay, the contracts that we have with logistics, on accommodation, all the kind of money that goes into these places. And I think it's not an easy thing to think about how we make change, because this is really fundamental now to how these economies work. So that's quite a high level kind of starting point, but I think the emphasis on the systemic nature of this challenge is really critical. And I think, but we also need to be quite clear-eyed about how deep the challenge is if we're going to start unpicking that. And we really do need to kind of reimagine the way that humanitarian operations work. And then secondly, even more hard, that's hard enough perhaps, but even more hard, we need to think about how we then translate one into the other, which I think is possibly even more challenging. So that was one kind of big picture thing. The second big picture thing is around, I think, this issue of mobility and displacement, and that's what REDS works on as well, and that we've worked on a lot in the Somali context. And I think I really kind of welcome your findings and reflections around the need to understand mobility in a positive as well as a negative sense. And again, I think that's true well beyond Somalia in this region. We need to also kind of understand the sort of political tensions that can exist here between individuals who have a kind of strong desire, appetite, and incentive to move and to find ways to make their networks work for them in situations of crisis. And then kind of authorities at multiple levels, at very local levels, at FMS level, at national level, who then have their own ideas about where they want their populations to be, and quite legitimate ideas as well. And there is a kind of fundamental, well, there can be a fundamental tension there. And I think as we think through, I was particularly struck by some of the language you had around how do we support aid that can flow fluidly between urban and rural areas. I really like that language. I think that's something that's really worth reflecting further on and thinking innovatively about how we do. So I just want to say something, Paul, I see you there, so I'm sure you're rushing me. Let me just say a couple of things about what we, how we might kind of move forwards. And it seems to me there's kind of two tracks that we might want to think about. One is about this kind of big systemic kind of system-wide change piece, which is beyond any individual organization and actor. And I think there's been a lot written about over the years, but it's extremely hard to do at a sensible level. And I think maybe we could use your kind of report as a starting point for having a serious discussion about, over the next 5 years, how could the humanitarian system in Somalia work a bit differently and look a bit differently. We need to do that in a certain kind of way, with some really clear principles, maybe some shared objectives, some shared visions for what's most important. And then the second track is really maybe about kind of the small stuff, or the smaller stuff, but which could make a big difference, and the kind of work that goes on around piloting, around testing different approaches. And I think there are people on this call who can talk about some of their experiences of the past couple of years, which are very much in line with, I think, the findings of the report, whether it's trying to kind of leverage diaspora resources, whether it's trying to kind of access hard to reach areas in different ways, in different kind of partnerships. And then the last thing I'll say is just, I think there is a kind of golden thread that kind of runs through this. All of this, which is around accountability and governance. And that, for me, is the kind of biggest problem with the kind of systemic way that the humanitarian system operates in a place like Somalia, is that fundamentally we're not accountable to the people, even if we try at the margins. And so we do contribute to this kind of overall environment of capture by different elites, and it kind of becomes a free-for-all. And so I think whether we're thinking about the big picture or we're thinking about individual activities and projects, we need to think about how do we approach governance and local accountability in a far more serious and deep way that goes beyond feedback mechanisms, beyond accountability structures, but really to kind of actually kind of bringing different actors together, engaging with meaningful local governance and putting them in positions of authority over our interventions. We have a piece of work coming out quite soon on exactly that topic. And it'd be great to see how we can move all this forward. But let me stop there. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Freddie. Lots and lots of food for thought there, and I think we'd certainly sort of agree with you that we hope that the report will be a sort of a starting point for further reflections and work with the system and with the all sorts of systems about and how we can sort of take forward some of the big recommendations around rethinking approaches. I'm going to hand over now to Adris Sheikh Dar, who's the Executive Director of WASDA, a national NGO implementing humanitarian and development and peacebuilding programs across the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus, across the Somalia-Kenya border. Adris is, as well as running an NGO for many years, is on the Nexus Platform Steering Committee, has been a member of the Somalia Humanitarian Country Team and the Somalia Humanitarian Fund Advisory Board, so has sat in many of these senior level strategic discussions about how to shape humanitarian action in Somalia. So we'll look forward to hearing his reflections on the report. I'm hoping he's about to appear on my screen and unmute. Are you with us, Adris?
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me?
Yep. We're not seeing you just yet, but
okay. I don't want to be seen. Thank you very much, Peter and the Center for Humanitarian Change for giving me this opportunity to reflect on this report, and thank to those who funded this research. It came at the time when we really got out of one crisis and then into another one. So the lessons that are in the reflections here are relevant, very relevant today. So my reflection on, I'll go topic by topic on response, and I will be excused. I'll be speaking from a humanitarian systems insider perspective. So I'll be touching base. I may sound petty sometimes, but unless we improve the basics and the grassroots, then we will not reach far. So that's this is how I see it. You know that the humanitarian response, as reflected in the report, there was delay, and the delay was due to some traditional things like time taken to fundraise. This one. The other one is increasing global crisis. Ukraine, Sudan, last came again this year. There's so many priorities for those who give to humanitarian aid to look at. So the delay came because of that. And then one other thing about the response in Somalia is UN, fully UN cluster system center, and sometimes as normal, the UN, huge bureaucracy, some delays may come because of that. Multiple layers from the country team to the clusters to the regions to the provinces. So to see that through that takes some time. And then also the responses delay because of something that was mentioned somewhere else in this report about institutional memory. There is very high turnover among humanitarian workers in Somalia. Within them is huge, moving from local to international to UN, from UN to ICRC, to the Red Cross, to the Red Crescent. Huge turnover. Therefore, capacity that are built over one drought and the next are lost in the humanitarian actor institutions because of that. So you'll find new people again who have to start from scratch to learn how to climb that ladder of the humanitarian system. And then our humanitarian response we have seen this year became more in a hybrid system. The formal humanitarian UN system, we know the cluster system, those kinship support. We have seen people begging in the streets of Mogadishu, hundreds of thousands of them, and major other towns. We have seen people looking around for casual labor. We have seen people coming to town, to Mogadishu and major towns, to collect something like the Zakatul Fitra. That is the alms you have to give at the end of Ramadan, which is compulsory. So one lady, I and the CEO of Gredos, sometime we asked us, Ramadan, why are you here? You look young. She said, I've just come to collect. the zakat at the end of Ramadan and come back. Then there's also one other thing that we need to raise and we need to seek and research is dwindling diaspora support, because the people who left Somalia have retired from work in the Western world or wherever they want to. Their kids, well, now others have different viewpoints about Somalia, different priorities. Their focus is elsewhere other than supporting the kin in Somalia. So that's one issue we need to look at. Then on mobility, communities move this year faster because they have learned from previous droughts. There's large-scale advocacy information that the race will fail. So repeatedly, communities by actors through news networks, outlets like radios, but also the team support was encouraging people to move in good time, financially and verbally, telling the people to move, don't wait like the other time. And then on mobility, I think there is need, as Guhad mentioned, there's need to understand more the complex web of mobility. Doing a research or undertaking some study will do us good so that we understand that complex web. About IDP centers being attraction for people moving from rural areas, and we are not seeing impactful solutions right now. There's need to rethink about finding a permanent solution for IDPs. Then the issue of marginalization exclusion, there has been some advocacy as mentioned in the report, has worked, but there are risks. One, small communities, excluded communities, marginalized communities live within the umbrella, within the protection of the larger clans. So if they bring their voices out, if they are seen, if they become prominent, they risk that action by the larger hosting community to kick them out or to harm them. So that may trigger actions against them. So it's a risk that we have to watch out for. And then culturally, there are some excluded marginalized communities that don't come out. Like what we call the Gibilat in Somalia, the Arabs, the Bajunis, the Barawas. These coastal communities have a strong cultural system that do not allow them to seek help even when they are in need. So again, that's something that we need to watch out for. And the issue of corruption is through the systematic corruption in some actors. There is need. There is the funding of the most of the school organizations in Somalia going on now. We have found people of funding individuals other than organizations. So I agree with that. There's not something need to do about it. One of my recommendations, which will come later, is the Somalia NGO bill is stuck between two ministries, Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Planning. Each minister is saying it is mine. So it's stuck in Parliament, and there hasn't been the Prime Minister and the President have not acted on those ministries and given direction. So you find that because there's no control in the humanitarian system, and registration of NGOs is done at district level, at the state level, at the federal level, then everybody and anybody has an NGO in Somalia if you speak 2 words of English, and that brings the systematic corruption to make it easier. And then there is also at times of crisis when money came late, like the last drought, this one of 2023. There is demand to ban out money because people have to meet burnout rates. They have to submit reports. The projects are usually 6 months, 3 months, 6 months. So that facilitates hasty decision making, which are wasteful in many times. For us, which I want to sound again, and I've said that with the humanitarian coordinator, Somali humanitarian, is that the contribution diversion, which is being blown out of proportion. The role for us actors is very limited after distribution. After giving out money, we only do PDM, and information we get from the beneficiaries during PDM is optional. That the beneficiary can give you or how you use the money or not. Again, there are two things that we cannot stop in humanitarian aid. One is the sale of the goods we give, and the other one is sharing of the relief we give. Somebody, you may give $100, may give divide it into 10 and give it to 10 households. So you may give somebody a bag of rice, that person can sell it and do that one with something else, even marry with it sometimes. So we can't stop that. So about this distribution diversion and corruption, there are a lot of things we have about it. And then there's one thing that promotes corruption and diversion is the duplicity of one person into many times over. Because in South Central there's no identification, there's no database. I can get 20 SIM cards and register with 20 different organizations in the same name, or 10 or 20 different names. There's no way to identify me, therefore, and people are taking huge advantage of that. For hard to reach areas, there are actors, as mentioned in the report, that are already there, but the support from mainstream humanitarian system is not very much. Therefore, there's need for trust and tolerance of actors working hard to reach areas, especially in Al-Shabaab held areas. Then there's also need to think of alternative accountability system for actions we take in hard to reach areas. Pictures are not allowed. You can take thumbprints, yet you want to aid people, you have to give a report. So there's need to think of alternative accountability system for people in hard to reach areas. Then for Somali systems.
Adris, can I just, last 30 seconds, we need to get to Javier and then have a bit of time for Q&A.
For Somali, I don't think I can say what I have in 30 seconds because I need 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute.
Somali systems, finally, there's low trust, of course, of all aid actors, whether it is TSOs or government agencies, because of what has happened. Last year, there was food that came from one of these Arab countries. It was divided up in the Mogadishu port, and it was all over the news. So people see that, and they don't trust us and the government. And then they also, federal government is not, what do you call, it's not delegating humanitarian response as a tool to the state governments. It wants to retain everything centrally and so that it can control. Then also, how do you go about the UN centered humanitarian system and the UN patronage in the humanitarian system is another thing that kills this system. The issue of diverted humanitarian approach, again, the UN cluster system, the Arabs come with their way. The Turkish, some people want accountability, some people want evidence that you have distributed. Some who pays the cut don't want any evidence and any mention. So my actions, there's need to sieve the humanitarian actors, and that will be done if the NGO bill is passed. And there's formal registration of NGOs, and there's independent office that handles NGOs and humanitarian assistance. And the need to act to support local actors where institutional memory remains longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adris. And sorry to cut you a bit short. It's a very rich reflections, but I'm conscious of wanting to give the floor to people for questions. Last up, we have Javier Navarro, who's the head of office with ECHO Somalia. Before that, he was the head of office for ECHO in Yemen and Iraq. And before that, a long, distinguished career working in emergencies for NGOs, research institutes, and UN agencies. So Javier, over to you for the final reflections, and do keep posting comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to respond to them, both when we open it up to the floor and also in the chat. Javier.
Thank you, Paul, colleagues, and thank you, Peter, colleagues, for the opportunity and most importantly for the work that has been done. I think it's important. I have the luxury to have been on this one from the beginning, let's say from 21. And I think it's important to reflect a little bit also how this response was allowed to be guided in a way. A number of colleagues online were kind enough to indicate the lessons learned of those of us who were new to Somalia. And I have to say a number of the elements that are reflected as potential good practices or elements that have been improved in the response during 21, 22, 23, particularly with regards to inclusion of minority groups, marginalization, and hard to reach, come also from the inspiration and the push of some of the colleagues online, of Nisar, Peter, and others. That is important to keep in mind, but it's also important to keep in mind that at the time, the narrative also, some of these colleagues and others, was very much along the lines of no regrets and the necessity to quickly speed up the response and deliver a set of common basics to as many people as possible in the quickest manner feasible. And we need to understand that generates a tension in the system in order to deliver at scale, but also to deliver with the required accountability and the thought processes that are required. So a caveat for those of you who would still remain around for the next one, that's one element of language that we might need to revise more generally speaking. There is another element on the response or on the analysis of this report that I think is significant to reflect on how we will go about it in the crisis to come, and it's particularly with the IDP response. With the IDP response, there were significant efforts at the end of 21 and 22 to scale up the capacity of response in areas of origin, let's say, in rural, riverine areas. But the crisis that came on top would definitely have surpassed any level of investment that would have been done in those areas of origin. So we also need to recognize that while there is the pull and push factors that remain on the IDP response, the capacity for us as humanitarians to have a significant impact on those would probably be limited. Will also be more limited if we try to apply the lessons that have been learned through pilots. The response in Somalia after 30, 40 years has a lot of inertia. And what I would say that we need to move away from a pilot logic, and we need to be more brave in order to integrate and translate the research into actual practice. I don't think there is enough of that. I don't think also, in a way, there is enough specificity in a number of the research that has been done. We continue to refer to lessons to be learned, but specifically speaking, in terms of operations, what needs to be done differently, I generally find it missing. With that inertia of the Somalia response has also been aggravated, I would say, by an increased remoteness, detachment, and sometimes ignorance from the field reality. More and more of the response is aimed to be driven from Mogadishu airport, and less of it from the field level. And our capacity to integrate the realities, the Somali realities, into the humanitarian response are challenged. One of the elements that was very much reinforced, I would say, in 2021 was the necessity to incorporate, recognize, and work with diaspora contribution and Somali resilience capacity. That was already mentioned in 2021. As humanitarian actors, I think we have a struggle to actually encounter the pathways to capitalize and maximize the benefits of that. Final points. There are elements of tensions that as humanitarians we need to recognize. In the report, there is the mention of the necessity to bring back government to a leading front and to increase participation and collaboration and definition of the response, while at the same time we need to recognize that a number of these so-called hard-to-reach areas are so because we are operating in an active conflict country, where the government happens to be a party to the conflict. And for us as humanitarians to maintain an impartial and neutral capacity to intervene in those areas, we need to do so with both parties, not only with one side. I think that is also critical to remember. Final point, recognizing the reality of diversion in Somalia and the interface between the aid architecture culture and the Somalia realities requires significant disruption. This will not be a soft process where people are not necessarily aware. This needs to be disrupted and basically reconstructed in a way that is sensitive to Somali realities, but is also accountable to the requirements and mechanisms put in place by donor countries. Donor countries are also obviously accountable to taxpayers' money, and the support being provided to Somalia needs to be targeted and in benefit of the population that is most in need, not necessarily to existing structures that benefit around the delivery of assistance. So there needs to be a recognition that the system as such needs to be disrupted, and that will generate, that will upset the current established balance and political gains and political economy, which needs to be accounted for. Quick reflections. I don't want to take it much further. That way, Paul, maybe we gain some time for the Q&A.
Indeed. Thanks, Javier. And really welcome reflections. Panelists and authors, do you want to sort of come on screen so that we can have discussion? Great to hear from one of the important donors, a willingness to think about disruption and upset and what that might mean for how aid's provided and who it's provided to and through. And we take your point about reports that are frustratingly unspecific. It's hard to get the balance right between sort of big general recommendations and granular specific ones. As we're talking about, as Freddie was talking about, in some ways, it needs to be a sort of starting point for getting to the more specific granular types of recommendations that are needed to work out what you actually need to change. And I'd encourage you'd have that discussion with Peter and the other authors to think about what it means. We've had a few questions in the Q&A. A few of them focused on sort of what the commercialization of aid, what aid as a business sort of means in practice. Margie asking about, again, this idea of needing to be more specific, what change to the IDP system might look like in practical terms. And so Peter and colleagues, I don't know if either of you want to take one of those questions, and if people want to come in with new questions, do raise hands or put them in the chat. Peter, over to you, and or sort of Guhad for any immediate reflections. And Javier, there's a question from Melissa for you about whether you see any promising disruptions, or whether there are things from other contexts that you think might be promising to try in Somalia to disrupt things. Guhad, over to you, and then Javier, maybe if you feel that question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I have seen the question in the chat box, and which is asking the kind of commercialization, and what do I mean by displacement commercialization or business, making it business. And what is happening is that in some cases, or in most of the places, sometimes we have been moving around, or we have been doing research here and there and talking to IDPs and to different people. And what happens is that the IDPs themselves, when they come to the camps, or when they are brought to where they are settling, some, whether we call them gatekeepers or camp leaders or camp owners, some people call them, they are given different names. And what they do is that they receive these people because they are, disparate when they are arriving. They need some people to receive them and show them that they are caring. Then once they receive and give them a space to a place to settle, they will use the same people to attract resources. And the same people who have been settled there, of course, they needed somewhere to settle for the resources to come to them. But again, is that because they have been settled there, then they have to accept whatever terms that these guys or the owners or the camp owners or the camp leaders, whatever we call them, tell them or dictate for them. Apart from that, again, once they have been settled there and maybe welcomed, given some nice welcome when they were arriving, some of them, in some cases, for example, like Mogadishu and even partly in Baidoa, they cannot, some of the people cannot leave that place. It's like, oh, I have invested you when you came here, so you can't just leave it. So it's like turning it to be a kind of business issue where these people can trade on that one. That's what I mean in terms of commercializing it. Over.
Sorry, struggling to find the mute. Thanks, Guhad. Peter, then Javier.
Yeah, it is a big question that we haven't answered in the report very satisfactorily. It's an issue of the report and not being able to go into the depths of what does a transformation of the IDP response look like. I think the reason that we did that, not just because we had to keep to a certain number of pages, but also what we were trying to do was give backing to those within the humanitarian world and the development world who are already trying to rethink that, testing out things, and to mention a few, DRC or IOM or REDS or many others who I haven't mentioned, who are trying to work on that. So the intention of our report was not to give solutions, but was to sign that this needs to be taken, as Freddie said, from a much more systemic way across the whole of the system, and not just a few people a few organizations who are working on that now. And to come back to one of the comments, related comments that Javier had, our experience has been that each time that there's a crisis, and into the couple of years after the crisis, there are amazing people like you, Javier, and many others who make change happen. And they really do make the situation in Somalia much better. What's missing is that once you leave, then we have a period of quiet, and we don't have this longer-term sustainable perspective of how we change things. And in the case of the IDP response, we need, as humanitarians, to think about IDPs, urbanization, all of the other things that are going on in the world when we start to design the next IDP response. There's a lot of things that we won't be able to answer, but we can't keep using the excuse that it's not our job, or that it's not something that we can do anything about. Because what's happening with the IDP response is that we're making the very IDPs that we are trying to help more vulnerable for the future. We're making the urban areas more vulnerable for the future, and we are contributing to what's happening in the long term in Somalia. So we need to take the energy of people like you, Javier, and think about how we can have a wider view on IDP responses, how we can transform, and how we can make that sustainable change, rather than just change for each crisis. Over.
Thanks, Peter. Javier, I was going to bring you in on response to Melissa's question about sort of the disruption.
Thanks. Maybe just one easy one is to stop talking about IDP response. I don't think our response should be based on a status. I think our response should be needs-based. And that's one of the issues that, again, the response is very much targeted on a status. So then in Somalia, we end up having 4 million IDPs. They are all the same, regardless of having been displaced yesterday or 20 years ago. So the need to move towards a needs-based response, and also, as Peter mentioned, to an area-based response that is able to identify and recognize and work with needs and capacities as they exist in a given area, would be a promising way forward, moving from a status-based response that works around entitlement and no regrets towards a needs-based approach that also brings the independent assessment and the capacity of the response to provide a more tailored and effective response. I totally agree also with Peter on the necessity of institutional memory. It is only through people like them, but like him, like Nisar, and colleagues in ECHO previously, like Emmanuel, that I was able to bring in some of these elements. So we do need to institutionalize, and we do need to have a longer-term view in order not to lose the gains or to start reconstructing from scratch. Thanks.
Thanks, Javier. And I did, yes, nice to hear you echoing. I was replying in a comment to Margie that one of the things I thought you could relook at was sort of more dynamic targeting that doesn't treat displacement as a fixed category and provide, you know, aid on the long term to people based on that category. Adras, you've got your hand up. Floor's yours.
Just one point on IDPs and solutions for exiting them out of that. Many people will not want to go back to the rural communities because there's no services. There are no schools, there are no functional health systems, and they have found that their children are wasting, being recruited forcefully into armed groups. So options for IDPs going back with their children and families to the rural homes, especially in hard to reach areas, is there. So that's one thing that we should know.
Thanks, Adras. And that might set you up nicely, Freddie. Your floor's yours.
Thanks. No, it's just a brief point to add on to this question about how we go about transforming. And I think you're right about dynamic targeting. I think thinking about how aid can follow people and aid interventions can follow people rather than the other way around is really important. But again, there's a slightly more fundamental point I'd like to make, which goes back to what I was saying, which is that we have to involve the populations in talking about what that looks like, because and not just because for some kind of woolly nice idea about meaningful participation, but because they know what to expect, they know what will come, and they will behave a certain way because of it, and the kind of structures around them will behave a certain way because of it. So only if we have a discussion up front about what this is going to look like differently. These are active participants in this process, and so we have to find a way to start having that conversation so that actually we might have a chance of seeing some different responses and different behaviors. Because we can go away and design something all we want, but actually people will behave the same way unless we really think about how to avoid that. Thanks.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, and one of the fascinating things in the report is some of the detail in the clan narratives about the sort of growing strength and resilience of some clans and their learning from previous crises in how they as a clan have responded to this crisis and trying to reflect on what that might mean for what the aid system could do differently, as you say, is very important. I'm conscious of nearing an end of the time. A final question that UKHH wanted us to put to panelists was what one thing do you think you could take from this report and from the response in Somalia that might be useful for countries facing other challenges? So, you know, there are lessons from Somalia that might be applicable elsewhere. And I guess the flip from that, as we're saying, are there things from elsewhere that we might usefully bring in as we think about how to disrupt problems with the response in Somalia? So have a think about that. And I'll give the floor to Peter for any final reflections from the authorial team.
Yeah, thank you. I'm relatively new to writing reports like this, and when you write one of these reports with so many different themes, trying to connect them all together, and with all of the help of my very experienced researchers bringing in all of their perspectives. One of the things I've learned from the report is the moment that you press that button and send off the final copy, you spend the rest of the week thinking, I should have put that in and I should have put that in. And a lot of the questions that have come back from people who've read it is, why didn't you be more comprehensive in making suggestions about the recommendations? Why weren't you more concrete? We know that you know those things, you have the experience. We weren't able to do that. And the idea of the report is that we are all still available here as researchers, together with people like our discussants, to go into detail in quite a few of the points that are there that we've left hanging, that we've made very general but very direct recommendations on. And we are available for more in-depth discussions of particular sections, or to facilitate and build on some of the very general statements that we've made there, and all of the efforts that those of you who are working in Somalia are already doing to work on those issues. When I think about how it can be applied elsewhere, I think that Freddie has already alluded to the differences between places like South Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia. But I think that all of those of you working in those other countries will certainly see the reflections in the need to re-look at how we categorize IDPs, how can we make aid follow people, and talk less about, for instance, when we talk about access, we tend to talk about access for us to the people, and we don't talk about access for the people to us and to aid and where they are and so on. So I think that although we're a very Somali-oriented organization, group of researchers, that we bring to our recommendations a background of understanding what would be useful for elsewhere. So thank you to all my authors, and I'll hand back to Paul.
Thanks, Peter. And just building on that point from Peter, this is one event at which we're launching the report, but Peter and colleagues will also be doing more in Nairobi and in Somalia to sort of feed the thinking from the report into sort of concrete recommendations. And I've already been doing that, for instance, in the series of meetings held with BHA and other actors in Somalia about how to tackle diversion challenges. And yeah, I'm thinking about other contexts where it's relevant to think about the sort of how you're targeting on displacement. Iraq springs to mind, where kind of the whole response was framed around displacement, and that perhaps needs rethinking. Floor's open to panelists for final thoughts, either about sort of lessons from this or elsewhere, or any other final thought you want to bring in. And feel free to say no if you've said your fill. I can see Freddie waving at me. So
I think I've said enough. So yes, no, and I also touched on the point around, I think certainly elsewhere in the region where this is highly relevant. And maybe the only thing to say is that certainly we as Reds are kind of very happy to support the team in thinking about how we take this discussion forwards, certainly in the kind of displacement solution kind of policy discussions that are ongoing. I support that ongoing process. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Freddie, and we'll think about how to take you up on that. Javier, Adris, anyone else wanting to come in? You had with
I've said what I thought I would say in the time given, so nothing more.
Okay, thank you hugely for joining, Adris, and good luck with the important work that WASDA's doing. Javier.
Maybe just one quick point. The work that is currently being put forward in Somalia with regards to a system-wide and longer-term reflection, as Peter mentioned, with regards to aid diversion, how do we as humanitarian or as the aid system enables it or fits to and from it, is important, is critical, and I have not seen it happening proactively in countries, potentially also in the absence of a scandal. So I think it would be interesting, important to bring forward the approach to other countries. Sudan is going through a significant scale up at the moment of the response, and it might benefit from this type of reflection, but potentially others. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, and not least Ethiopia, of course, as well, where there are some challenges. And well noted. Right, I think we're coming to an end. Thank you, everyone, for keeping so well to time, so that we'll leave you with 2 minutes of your life back, give or take. It's been a real pleasure to host the meeting. Thanks hugely to Elra for hosting. Thank you to UKH for supporting the report. Thank you to FCDO for funding it. As Liz is just posting, we have recorded the event, and so we'll be putting it up on the website. Do send it on to people you think might be interested. Do read the report, and if we've whetted your appetite, and if you haven't already, do send it on to other people. And most importantly, do stay in touch with with Peter, Nisar, Guhad, and Irina and colleagues, and talk to them about how to take the findings from the report forward in making the response in Somalia more effective, more accountable, better able to respond to crises, better able to work with Somali and Somali capacities in ensuring more effective responses as the need to support Somalia continues. My first job within Somalia was in 1994, so we're about to hit the 30-year anniversary of that, and aid has been a fairly continuous presence. So clearly we need to think short-term in response to the devastating floods currently going on, but long-term in terms of how we can do better to support Somalia over the decades to come. And on that note, I will say thank you very much and goodbye to all.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you all.